The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anush Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. Hope you're all well. We had the Global Go webinar last week, which I think went well. Despite doing this podcast for the last couple of years, I still get quite nervous about these sort of things. Might be because I'm on screen. They do say I have a face for radio, so maybe my nerves make sense. As a recap, it was an overview of medical cannabis in the UK. Lots of interesting insights, but probably the one that people have mentioned to me the most in person was from Ed McDermott from Seed Innovations and EMAC Life Sciences. With his investor hat on, he discussed being a bit disappointed at the quality of deal flow in the UK, crazy valuations based on projects that haven't started yet, or where the founders simply hadn't researched the market properly. It is disappointing to hear that, but not something I'm entirely surprised to hear, sadly. I think the industry as a whole, not just in the UK, can often have more excitement than substance, so what Ed says does make a bit of sense. Hopefully, though, it's some good feedback and a call to arms for those thinking about getting involved. In sort of topical news, the German election has just happened as this episode goes live. It's a narrow win for the Social Democrats, so a coalition of some sort will be needed. And this will no doubt take some weeks or even months to lock in. But it seems that all the main parties who are likely to be involved have cannabis reform on their agenda. So that should make things quite interesting for the industry as that unfolds. Anyway, on with the show. I'm really pleased to have my Global Go colleague Sibs from South Africa on to talk about Africa. Enjoy. On today's show, I have Sibusiso Xaba, who is co-founder and CEO of the Africa Cannabis Advisory Group. He's also a fellow Global Go consultant, heading up things in Africa. So, Sibs, welcome. How are you today?
Thanks so much, Anush. So great to be on the podcast. Really good. It's a bit of a turbulent and rocky time in Southern Africa, but yeah, generally good to be here.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you're safe. It's, some crazy things going on. But we'll focus on cannabis today as the topic of the show and actually get to understand a little bit about cannabis in Africa. There's far too much to go through to fit it into just one show. So we're going to get you to give us a bit of a high level. But before we start that bit, it'd be great to just find out a bit about you. So maybe you tell us a bit about your background and how and why you got into cannabis.
Sure. So I was actually born in Eswatini, which is a small landlocked country here inside South Africa and bordered by Mozambique as well. Grew up in South Africa, studied at the University of Cape Town, and was afforded an opportunity to move to London after graduation and began my career in investment banking in London. You know, it was meant to be sort of a 1 or 2 year stint, to just get some international experience. It ended up being an 8-year sort of career in investment banking. But I think I was quite fortunate that during my time in London, probably 80 or 90% of my professional work was focused on the African sort of market. So, I'd work with a broad range of stakeholders in Africa, including governments, corporates, financial institutions such as pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, asset managers, and the like, and sort of structure and execute interesting deals that would quite often involve mobilizing international capital into Africa. So for me, I kind of stumbled across the cannabis industry when I was actually doing some research on agricultural entrepreneurial opportunities more generally on the continent. I'm one of those individuals who wasn't, a user and an activist and, had this passion for the plant like, so many of my wonderful colleagues had. But that research spurred a lot of curiosity around the industry. And I took some time to really deep dive and understand what was happening and what cannabis really represented. And I think through that research process, my perception of what cannabis was completely transformed. Looking at the incredible versatility of the plant and the potential of cannabis to really play a meaningful role in helping Africa realize its economic potential and address challenges such as industrialization, rural development, job creation, and so forth. And I think that really resonated with me as someone who's always been passionate about looking for means to support the development of the continent. And I think after a trip to Israel, I actually went out to Canatech in Israel. That really, really sort of, opened my eyes and gave me, incredible context in terms of what the future of the industry would look like. And I think that was enough for me to quit my job and, pack my bags, head back to South Africa. I think also after the seventh London winter, I'd also reached my cap in terms of the cold out there. So it wasn't too difficult of a decision to make that leap into the entrepreneurial sort of journey and to back on the continent and into cannabis in particular.
Wow, that is quite a journey, and like great kind of motivations for getting into the space. And I mean, I always do talk about it, but did you, given the nature of cannabis and it's been very stigmatized for so long, did you have any apprehensions about getting involved in this sector, because of that, maybe from family, friends, colleagues, that kind of thing?
So there was quite a lot. I think for me, it really did take that research, that deep dive into the industry to change my mind. I think, well, firstly, to understand it. It was more out of curiosity. But I think once I had kind of realized what cannabis really represented in terms of its ability to address healthcare challenges, wellness and mental health challenges, industrialization and sustainability, I was sold. I became, the biggest evangelist for the industry after that. And I think there was a lot of skepticism from family, from friends, from colleagues. But I think that passion and that belief in the potential of cannabis really contributed to helping people change their minds around what the plant was. At the very least, it caused people to sort of do their own research and, get a bit more of an updated view of what cannabis represents. And so managed to navigate that tricky period of of skepticism quite well in the end, because I think it was really informed by research and by very tangible case studies from across the globe around what cannabis was doing for people, for societies, and for countries.
Yeah, no, that echoes much of my experience as well. When you start to discover about the overwhelming positives that there are from a lot of this, it's exciting, coupled with the challenges of an emerging market. They can be quite, motivating, I think. So that's great. So yeah, why don't we talk about ACA, so the Africa Cannabis Advisory Group that you set up. Maybe you tell us a bit about how that all kind of came together and who you're working with and what sort of projects you're working on.
Sure. So the first thing I did after I quit my job in investment banking is that I went on a sort of international networking and research trip for about 4 months. So I spent about 2 months in Israel, which, has been a pioneer in the scientific and medical applications of cannabis, meeting various stakeholders on the ground. I spent about a month in Canada, which has really been the leader in terms of mobilizing capital for the industry, not only in North America, but internationally. And then about a month in Europe, looking to also try and understand what the European market would look like. As we know, that's anticipated to be the largest medical cannabis market in the world. And then sort of arrived back in South Africa. And I think, after spending a couple of months with some of the local operators, regulators, and stakeholders, I realized that there was a significant gap, particularly in two areas when it came to the African cannabis industry. The first one was that Africa was sort of lagging behind the rest of the world in terms of anticipating how the industry was going to evolve over sort of the next 5 to 7 years. And I saw this as a significant risk to the development of the African cannabis industry because of this sort of lag in and sort of in information, best practice, data, and so so forth. And then secondly, I saw a significant gap or lag in the way of capital. As we know, cannabis typically requires significant capital for the industry to get mobilized. And I saw the opportunity to use my skill set in investment banking and having spent years working with international investors and attracting those pools of capital into Africa to actually use that skill set with regards to the cannabis industry. So ACA, or Africa Cannabis Advisory Group, was set up as a services provider with a strong focus on sort of strategy consulting, investor readiness and capital raising, global sales and distribution. And the company works with a broad range of stakeholders, so governments, corporates, entrepreneurs, communities, and institutions, and helps in the formulation and execution of cannabis projects. We've got a partnership sort of model with 5 partners. There's a partner that sits here in Cape Town and in South Africa who helps focus on the investment and on the capital raising aspects of things, a gentleman named Derek Kutzer. I've got a partner in Israel who helps and focuses on the global sales and distribution aspect of things. We've also got a partner in Canada who's more focused on technology and technology solutions within the industry. And lastly, we've recently entered into a strategic partnership alliance with Global Go, which is based out in California. Global Go's got an incredible track record of servicing the cannabis industry in the US. We've been fortunate enough to engage and work with Global Go on a number of interesting sort of opportunities and mandates in the African context. And, as part of the broader Global Go Alliance, which has a number of partners in sort of key geographical locations, Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, Mexico, UK, Switzerland. We think it's an incredible platform to leverage our respective local expertise, with a network or platform that allows us to leverage other alliance partners' strengths and expertise to deliver compelling service that is, well calibrated for an international industry.
Absolutely. Yeah, well said. And yeah, it's great to be part of this Global Go family. So I'm glad to have joined. Cool. Well, that's great. And thank you. That's a great way to sort of approach things. And it sounds like you really rose to the challenge of, seeing that Africa could be kind of left behind a little bit unless it kind of got on it, and you're leading the charge. And so that's great to see. Now we can dig in a bit more on the kind of main topic of the show. And as I said at the top, it's a huge continent. It's far too difficult to summarize in one show. So maybe before we go into some country-specific stuff, where I assume you're going to start with South Africa, but maybe some of the other local territories that you probably know better and the ones that are more influential in this kind of emerging space. What is the general attitude to cannabis? And again, it's probably too difficult to give it one simple soundbite for the whole continent, but, what are the general attitudes, let's say?
Sure. So, look, I think Africa is quite a unique case with regards to cannabis for a number of reasons. Number one, the political leadership and establishment in Africa is quite old, actually, relative to the population. So you've got a situation where the decision makers and the policy makers have got an extremely conservative view generally around cannabis, around what it represents. It's still that perspective that cannabis is a dangerous substance and has got no value to add to society in general from the political side. However, I think what's really been quite encouraging over the last couple of years, and it's a bit of a debate on what's really spurred it, but the one catalyst around the enthusiasm around cannabis on the continent has actually been the economic challenges that countries are facing across Africa. And so you've got a situation where countries are moving forward and legalizing cannabis. However, usually this is with an economic agenda in mind and not with a belief in what cannabis can do, across a multitude of applications. And so our engagement has really been around demystifying what cannabis is, particularly to political leadership, but also connecting what cannabis can do with young people throughout the continent who are very enthusiastic and who've quite often have done a lot of work around understanding the medicinal value, the wellness value, and the industrial value of cannabis as well. It is certainly changing, and we're seeing that, across a number of countries where these sort of beliefs that are a bit archaic, have stalled the advancement of the industry, and more, decision makers are coming on board and really embracing and looking to understand how cannabis can be used. Not only it can be leveraged, not only in terms of international exports and sales, but also around domestic, healthcare challenges, industrialisation challenges, rural development challenges, and so forth. So it's trending in the right direction. However, depending on where you look, in some places it is moving quite slowly.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I characterize the European market as in a similar way. And if I was to reduce it to one word, it would be conservative. In some way, I like the fact that you kind of highlighted the fact that it's economic drivers rather than the actual kind of societal benefits that are kind of pushing it forward. And I suppose if you're interested in your part of this industry, you'll take it whichever way it happens. But I think we'd rather have the kind of meaningful societal impact being understood as, and that being at the forefront. But, maybe there's a chance to flip that on its head at some point.
Exactly. I think any progress is good progress. There will be, a lot of, let's say, suboptimal results due to the underlying, concerns around cannabis. But I think as countries do take tentative steps towards establishing a cannabis industry, and as we begin to see, the likes of the US, Canada, Europe, Australia really establish their cannabis industries, I think the incremental move from, this sort of really, really conservative approach towards an industry, towards a fully fledged, robust, local industry is a much easier one to take than from, starting from zero, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we drill in a bit on some of the kind of major nations that are leading the charge? I mean, a lot of my reflections on the way that people talk about Africa is predominantly seen as a kind of low-cost production hub. But what's the actual reality, and what's the things that you're seeing?
Sure. So I think that is definitely the perception around Africa. And I think, it rightly so in many ways. I think we do have, the right sort of climate. We do have, a cost structure that's significantly lower than most of the Northern Hemisphere in terms of being able to cultivate and produce cannabis. And I think that's something we do actually have to leverage and work at refining and becoming exceptionally good at executing from that perspective. And so a significant amount of the capital that has been raised or deployed within the African cannabis industry, I'd say probably 80-90%, has been towards cultivation. However, like if we look at South Africa, for example, South Africa has got one of the world's leading agricultural industries. It's got a very well-established and globally competitive pharmaceutical industry. So, in the case of, let's say, a South Africa, a country that with those advantages, there is an opportunity for South Africa to sort of lead the charge in terms of value-add services around processing, around formulation, manufacturing, research and development, and so forth. And so, the perception around just Africa being a low-cost producer is very limiting in terms of what Africa can actually do and become within the cannabis industry. But I do think slowly but surely, various stakeholders, including investors, governments, entrepreneurs, are beginning to see the bigger picture of the potential of the industry and applying themselves towards leveraging or developing capabilities that will ensure that Africa moves just beyond that simple sort of perception around the cultivation aspect.
Sure. So great. That's good kind of preface to it. Do you want to kick off with maybe South Africa and then highlight a couple of the other countries that sort of are making waves?
Sure, exactly. So I think maybe just before I delve into South Africa, I think Lesotho is probably, I think, the case study for the African cannabis industry. I think Lesotho made a really smart kind of a strategic decision to become the first African country to create a legal cannabis industry. Lesotho is a tiny country, I think population under 2.5 million people. And the cannabis industry has really been a significant, contributor to sort of economic growth and opportunity in the country. By our estimates, the country has attracted roughly $200 million of foreign direct investment into the industry and helped to create north of 5,000 direct and indirect jobs related to the broader cannabis industry over the last couple of years. And, we've got a number of really, really compelling, sort of case studies to look at in terms of early movers in the Lesotho industry. For example, example, I think the kind of African case study for the cannabis industry is a company called MG Health, which has done some really great work in terms of pioneering the African cannabis industry. But I think what we've seen in Lesotho really was a wake-up call to the rest of the continent. And I think particularly South Africa, where the expectation was that South Africa, due to the advantages I mentioned earlier around having an already well-established, large-scale agricultural industry, a large-scale processing and agri-processing industry, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, research and development capabilities. I think what we saw in Lesotho really, kind of sparked a significant transition into sort of moving forward on cannabis. And I think since Lesotho's, sort of a step forward in terms of this industry, South Africa has really now come to the fore in terms of looking to develop the local industry here. This has happened sort of in a number of areas, but where we sit today is that South Africa is actually finalizing its cannabis national master plan. So South Africa has had a number of these master plans, the most notable of which has been the auto industry master plan, which has, really pulled together various stakeholders to mobilize capital towards developing and growing the already existing manufacturing base in automotives. So the cannabis master plan that South Africa is sort of finalizing now indicates that, the government realizes the value of this potential, the value of this industry and its potential, and is now beginning to, sort of mobilize various stakeholders, resources towards ensuring that South Africa is the African leader and a global leader within the cannabis industry.
Fantastic. And what's the kind of domestic situation there in relation to cannabis and cannabis use within society?
Sure. So interestingly enough, South Africa is one of the world's largest producers of illicit cannabis. I think it's estimated that there's over 900,000 smallhold farmers that grow cannabis for sustenance and north of 2.5 million cannabis users. So there's a very ingrained cannabis culture in South Africa, which is a great platform for the legal industry. So South Africa really made its mark in the cannabis industry in 2018 when the Constitutional Court ruled that the growing and consumption of cannabis within a private space is a human right, and therefore basically began the process of changing South Africa's laws to allow for cannabis consumption at an individual level. The country then descheduled cannabis from its sort of, most stringent, kind of scheduling towards a much more palatable scheduling, sort of moving CBD to sort of almost over the counter, depending on sort of the concentration of the product, but also THC now being able to be prescribed by doctors. The country then implemented and began issuing medical cannabis licenses. So South Africa has issued roughly, I think, 29 licenses to date, and a lot more sort of in the pipeline for approval. However, I think the big challenge within the South African context and across, I think, a number of African countries is that not enough work has been done in terms of establishing a local industry. So there's still some changes to legislation that need to happen, for example, to allow for the commercial hemp industry to get off the ground, and also a framework around how locally grown cannabis can be distributed to patients in South Africa. And so the country has taken some very, very encouraging steps around establishing its industry. However, there's still some very significant bottlenecks that make it extremely challenging for local producers to establish, sustainable businesses. But I think what is particularly encouraging is the fact that the master plan is in motion. It's a very comprehensive in terms of all the touch points that are going to be important for a robust, mature industry. And now it's just a matter of moving forward around some of the legislative changes that need to happen, and then sort of an agreed and finalized master plan across the different stakeholders, and then execution from there. And then I think, sort of end of 2022, 2023 is when the industry really kicks into fifth gear and begins to really, really thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it sounds like quite a familiar tale, to many nations in Europe as well, where it's very kind of export focused. We're happy to kind of send it abroad, but we don't want to hurt our own citizens with terrible cannabis, do we? But yeah, no, I mean, it's quite common, isn't it? But I guess the good thing about the master plan, as you describe it, will be hopefully it provides a very good template for some of your neighbours, and hopefully lots of other people can get on board. I kind of feel like that's the case with a lot of regulation. Everyone's kind of looking to see who actually gets it right, and then you can copy it and use it, because Canada, California, they've had some wins and some losses, right? And it's been a bumpy road. So I don't think anyone's nailed it yet. So let's hope that South Africa can be the one. But maybe you can tell us a bit about a couple of the other main countries in Africa where there's some real action happening.
Sure. So I think two really interesting case studies in Southern Africa in terms of the industry are Zimbabwe and Malawi. Both have got a very well-established tobacco industry and a model that actually incorporates smallhold farmers in terms of cultivation and processing around tobacco. However, tobacco prices have begun to decline pretty significantly over the last couple of years as consumer trends change and less people smoke. And that's really hit the bottom lines of these countries quite significantly. Both have now basically indicated that they would like to shift towards a industrial hemp-based economy as a substitute for the challenges that they're seeing in tobacco. And I think for us, this is extremely encouraging in that these governments are beginning to sort of realize the potential of hemp across a number of applications and are taking real concrete steps towards establishing local hemp industries and sort of getting entrepreneurs, smallhold farmers, local investors on board in terms of really supporting the development and growth of the hemp industry.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, cool. I wasn't expecting you to highlight those guys. So it's great to hear about that. I mean, it'd be difficult to kind of not comment on maybe some of the North African countries. Maybe Morocco is probably the most prominent in this space. What are you seeing over there as well?
Yeah, so very encouraging. I think, look, North Africa has a long history of cultivation, use of cannabis, export of cannabis. Morocco is one of the largest, if not the largest, export of cannabis into Europe. And so we've had some really encouraging developments there around establishing a legal cannabis industry. I think that, quite often we have this focus on sort of sub-Saharan Africa, but there's obviously a much broader, ecosystem around the Africa opportunity. And I think North Africa has got a very, very, strategic sort of proximity to the largest consumer market, the largest future consumer market for medical cannabis. And so that is very encouraging, particularly because it's such a conservative, much more conservative probably than the rest of Africa when you look at, general perceptions around, sort of cannabis. And so I think that also really is a significant contributor towards the broader trend that I think we'll begin to see accelerate across the continent.
Yeah, fantastic, cool. Well, thank you, Sibs. As I said, it's we can't really do it justice in one show. There's far too many countries to sort of cover. So thank you for highlighting some of them, and I'm sure there's some great stories in some of the other nations as well. I guess to kind of round things off, maybe a bit of crystal ball gazing. Where are you seeing things kind of pan out over the next couple of years?
Sure. So I do think that South Africa executing on the National Master Plan will be the key catalyst for the rest of Africa to firstly legalize cannabis, but also to embrace a local cannabis model. I think there will initially be a very strong focus on medicinal and wellness, but I think in time that's also going to, also open up an adult use market. I also think that US federal legalization and the opportunity for African countries to trade with the US is also going to be sort of another catalyst that's going to really begin to see an acceleration of development across the African cannabis industry. But I do think that, as I said, the progress we have had is encouraging, but we do really need to embrace the plant in terms of domestic use, because we've got over 1 billion sort of consumers and potential users of various cannabis products, whether that's medicinal, wellness, industrial. And so, if we can calibrate the cannabis industry to really, address challenges in Africa and then sort of use that as a foundation to then sort of export international or interesting applications internationally, I think that would really help Africa be really a significant player, not only locally, but internationally within the mature cannabis industry.
Absolutely. I think it's a great way to round off the show. Thank you. Sibs, really appreciate it. Always great to chat to you. So thank you for joining me today. And I'd love to have you back on as well to sort of follow up and see how things are progressing.
Awesome. Thanks so much, mate. And the one thing I will just quickly end off with is that Your podcast was actually one of my key sources of research and information before I'd started this journey. So a massive thank you to the incredible work that you continue to do. I mean, it's grown from strength to strength, and I'm not surprised because I think it's such a wealth of knowledge, experience, and you're doing a fantastic job of educating, societies across the world around what this plant is all about. So massive congratulations to you, and look forward to further collaboration and working with you.
That's brilliant, Sibs. Thank you so much for those kind words. You can definitely come back on the show. Thank you, mate. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much, mate.
Take care. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe, rate, review, and share the podcast. It will help me spread the good word on how this amazing industry is developing. I work with various cannabis startups to help them get funded and grow. I also work with corporates and international cannabis companies to help them understand and navigate the European cannabis sector. We're working with some great clients across the cannabis value chain, and we'd love to help you too. If you're interested, please visit www.canverse.global to get in touch.